Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, jointly sponsored by Nicaragua Webinars and the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group, entitled "This is What Democracy Looks Like: A Cross-National Comparison." I'm going to ask that if you're not speaking, that you mute yourself, and that will help with any kind of additional background noise to make this audio as audible to everyone as possible. Thanks. Special thanks to our webinar host, the Massachusetts Peace Action, called MAPA, and to the many organizational co-sponsors listed on MAPA's webinar page, and to Yoav Elenevsky, who's providing our technical support today. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent out to all registrants within the next few days. Today's event is part of an ongoing monthly series founded and organized by Nan McCurdy and myself. My name is Barbara Larkham, and I'm one of your co-moderators today. I'm the coordinator of the Casa Baltimore Limay Friendship Project, linked with San Juan de Limay, Nicaragua. Louise?
And good evening from UK. I'm Louise Richards. I'm Trade Union and Communications Coordinator of the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group in the UK. One of our main activities is campaigning to defend Nicaragua's sovereignty and right to self-determination. We also work very closely with both the UK and Nicaraguan trade union movements, establishing and facilitating links between the two. I will put a link to our website in the chat so people can find out more about us. We look forward to hearing from a number of speakers today, and we'll introduce each of those in turn just before they speak. You'll see there's a chat function available at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to offer respectful comments in the chat throughout the event. We'll also be posting other information and links in the chat. You will have a chance to participate during questions and answers following the speakers. As you listen to their presentations, please offer any question you may have in the chat. Be patient when making a note of all the questions, but they may not be answered until the Q&A period. Before we begin, we've several announcements to make, and we'll make sure to post all the links in the chat as well. To stay up to date with events and issues in Nicaragua, you can sign up for the NicaNet email list, a Google group moderated list for people who support Nicaragua's progress and sovereignty. The link to sign up will be entered in the chat. You can also sign up for Nica Notes, which includes a weekly article by an invited author, followed by news updates of the week at the Alliance for Global Justice website, afgj.org. Several ebooks about Nicaragua are also available at the same website, free of charge in English and Spanish, and downloadable in several formats.
If you'd like to become more active in supporting Nicaragua's sovereignty and opposing U.S. interference there, you're invited to join our Nicaragua Advocacy Network, which is working to spread more accurate information about what's really happening in Nicaragua. Please put your name and email address in the chat if you're interested in joining us, and we'll include you in our meeting notices. Or you can also email us directly at, all one word, Nicaragua Advocacy Network @gmail.com to let us know. We've been meeting once a month, and the next meeting is on Monday, November 14th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, we stand in solidarity with the international protests that are going on this weekend against the Cuba blockade. You can look for a protest near you at a link that we'll post in the chat. Okay. Louise?
Okay, the format for today's 90-minute webinar is the following. First, Nan McCurdy will present briefs on recent Nicaraguan news. Then each of the other 4 speakers will have 12 minutes each for their presentations. One speaker, Tony Burke from the UK, has another obligation and may need to leave before our webinar ends, so he will take questions immediately following his presentation. The remaining Q&A will come after all presenters have spoken. And now to introduce Nan McCurdy, who will provide us with Nicaragua news briefs. Nan is the editor of the online weekly Nica Notes. She is a United Methodist missionary working in development in the countryside of Mexico. She lived in Nicaragua for over 30 years and continues to have deep connections there. Nan McCurdy, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you. Thanks to everyone who is joining us this October 30th. And here are some important news items from the last month. The new bridge over the Wawa River in the North Caribbean was inaugurated on October 19 and will benefit 235,000 people. This bridge connects the North Caribbean with the rest of the nation, overcoming historic isolation. The new bridge will allow safe transportation in a precarious flood-prone area and will also facilitate trade, tourism, and development of fishing production. The 255-meter-long bridge cost US $21 million. For the past 40 years, Wawa Boom and the surrounding communities have used a barge to cross the river. A World Bank study published last week indicates that with a poverty rate of 24.9%, Nicaragua is the 3rd country in Latin America with the fewest people living below the poverty line, surpassed only by Uruguay and Chile. Economist Frank Matus stated that Nicaragua has shown great commitment to the eradication of poverty. In 14 years, the country has managed to reduce the poverty rate by 23 points, going from 48.3% of the population living in poverty in 2007 to 24.9% in 2021. The international agency S&P Global Ratings upgraded Nicaragua's long-term ratings to B for economic recovery and a stable outlook. According to the latest report, the economy is recovering after successive shocks in recent years. It notes that cautious fiscal and monetary policies have stabilized the economy. We raised our long-term sovereign ratings to B from B- on Nicaragua, says S&P Global Rating. Nicaragua overcomes deficiencies in anti-money laundering systems. During the plenary session of the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, held last week in Paris, it was announced that Nicaragua has overcome deficiencies and is no longer subject to the FATF increased monitoring process on countries with deficiencies in their anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing systems. The press release says FATF welcomes the progress of Nicaragua in improving the elements of its anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing systems. On October 21st, the Free Trade Zones Commission, the workers' unions, and companies under the Free Trade Zone signed a tripartite salary agreement to guarantee stability for 140,000 Free Trade Zone workers. The minimum wage will increase by 8% in 2023 and in 2024. The agreement contributes to confidence in the sector. In 2022, more than 100 million is being invested in 20 drinking water and 20 wastewater projects. One of the projects finished is the North Caribbean city of Burke, which has quality drinking water for the first time in its history. The US $40 million project benefits more than 65,000 people. The Social Security Institute enrolled nearly 800,000 new workers as of June 31st. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, designated the cities of Grenada and Bluefields as members of the Global Network of Learning Cities. These are cities that demonstrate through public policies and effective learning practices that they are inclusive, safe, and resilient, contributing to the objectives of the UN 2030 agenda. UNESCO recognized the efforts of the Bluefields educational system to implement full access to education with cultural identity that has helped to preserve the Afro-descendant heritage of the city. The director of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations recognized Nicaragua's successes in reducing poverty and reducing hunger. He also recognized the investment potential and economic growth achieved. The Center for Disaster Prevention, Mitigation, and Attention, CINAPRED, organized the third multi-threat exercise for preservation of life on September 29th, with 2.5 million people participating in the exercise, simulating a magnitude 8 earthquake. 7,000 emergency committees in the most vulnerable areas were activated. Damages from Hurricane Julia total nearly $400 million, 2.6% of Nicaragua's GDP. There is damage in 96 municipalities and both autonomous regions. El Rama was completely flooded and is still in the process of normalization. Progress continues, distributing food packages, and the roof plan is working to make homes livable. A national reforestation campaign began October 24th in response to the impact of Hurricane Julia on the country's forests. And we would like to ask you to please consider making a donation through the Miguel de Soto Brockman Solidarity Fund. You can go to Nika Notes October 20th for details, and I will put all of that in the chat. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Nan, for that excellent roundup of current developments and activities in Nicaragua. I know in the UK, I find the Nika Notes, the weekly notes, so incredibly useful to find out what's going on. So thank you again. Our next speaker is Tony Burke from the UK. We remind you he'll be answering questions immediately following his presentation. So please put any questions for him in the chat during his talk. Tony Burke is a former Assistant General Secretary of the UK trade union Unite, who currently represents Unite within the international trade union movement. A trade unionist for over 45 years, Tony was previously the Deputy General Secretary of the Graphical Paper and Media Union. He was a member of the TUC General Council and Executive Committee, is a member of the Labour Party National Policy Forum, and is currently President of the Confederation of Shipbuilding and Engineering Unions. He's the trade union coordinator for the Morning Star newspaper in the UK, and a member of the board of the People's Press Printing Society, and also the executive committee of the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group. I should add, he's just received an award a couple of weeks ago, the TUC Gold Badge from the British TUC in recognition of his long years of service to the trade union movement. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Louise, and thanks very much for the introduction. It's been a long, hard road, but certainly been worth it. And I always welcome the opportunity to have this sort of discussion. I'm afraid that I have to leave a bit early, but I understand, comrades, that and Louise gave me a briefing that we want to talk about democracy and how it works, and particularly in the UK. Well, we've got 12 minutes in which to do it, and I'll try to keep within that time and say to you I'll explain what actually happens in the UK and why now democracy in the UK is under real threat from the government and from forces outside of the government who appear to want to hit trade unions hard and working people via employment legislation. And of course, the decision to leave the European Union is having an effect as well. Friends, situation in the UK is that the right-wing Conservative Party have a majority of around about 80. That's fluctuated a little bit because the Conservatives have had to suspend from the whip, actually from the party in Parliament, some of their people who have done things that are very unsavoury, and I wouldn't want to repeat them here. They won that election in 2019, leaving Labour with 196 sitting MPs. They themselves have 357. And we have a winner-take-all, first-past-the-post system in the UK. And this is for the National Parliament. So, of course, we also have, besides Labour in the opposition, who are the biggest opposition party, we have the Scottish National Party with 44 MPs, and I'll explain Scotland in a short while. Liberals with 14, Independents 13, and Sinn Féin in the Northern Ireland, Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, Plaid Cymru in Wales, SDLP in Northern Ireland, Alba Party in Scotland, Alliance in Northern Ireland, and one for the Green Party. One seat is vacant, and the other seat is the Mr. Speaker of the Parliament. Now, in the UK, first past the post gets in, and they add up the total number of MPs, and that is it. So if the Conservatives get a majority or Labour gets a majority over all other parties, they are invited, or were invited by the Queen, now the King, to form a government. The UK is made up of 4 separate countries, all with their own parliaments. So, for instance, in Scotland, their Holyrood Parliament has a majority of SNP, and they don't have first past the post. They have a procedure based around shared voting and proportional representation. And of course, that does not apply to the whole of Parliament. In Wales, they have a similar system where Labour is in power in Wales, and a very, very good Labour Party in power. We're very pleased about that. And of course, Northern Ireland at the moment does not have. We have a parliament. There are people been elected to it, but the government doesn't sit because the Democratic Unionist Party refused to take part, and because the power sharing agreement in Northern Ireland, after many years of troubles, is basically suspended, and they are going to call elections again for this December. So we've got this situation where winner takes all. I can say that in the UK now overall, the Labour Party have come around to looking at how we would implement a policy on proportional representation. I'm not sure how we're going to do that, because the Conservatives will not take part in that. Turkeys do not vote for Christmas, and they won't do that. The Lib Dems would support that, and I think some of the other parties would as well. But the problem is the Conservative Party have been in office for 12 years, and Labour has been on the outside. It's been a hard slog. But at this moment in time, Labour do have a significant lead in the polls, which is tightening up after some important events. One is the election of the Conservative government allowed Johnson to drive through leaving the European Union with the slogan, "Let's get Brexit done." It means we've got the hardest of hard agreements in regard to leaving the EU, and that's causing many problems. The government intends, they say, to repeal 2,400 pieces of European legislation from the UK statute book to break free of Europe. Can I say to you, comrades, that means that they will try to bring in legislation which will scrap statutory rights to legal holidays, holiday pay, breaks between shifts for workers, child labour, and a number of other things. It would also mean repealing legislation to protect workers who work for employment agencies, who work part-time, who are freelance workers, and also others who are protected by European legislation. It would also mean that the legislation to protect workers facing redundancy and job losses, again, would be repealed. Now, situation is simple. Johnson won by that majority. Then we had the COVID. He got Brexit done, he said, but we've not managed to reach, apart from a TCA agreement. There are many, many problems with the agreement, the Brexit deal, including the border with Northern Ireland, which is far too complex, even at this early hour of the evening, to go through, but it will cause major problems. Then we had the pandemic, and I think all of you will know that after a year, Johnson was feted for making sure the rollout of the vaccination was done well, but now all the problems of the pandemic are coming to the surface. And as you know from the media in your own countries, Johnson and his cohorts were responsible for basically, while the rest of the country was locked down, they were enjoying an ongoing party in 10 Downing Street. They lied. They handed contracts for protective equipment to their friends in industry. And Johnson was caught out too many times lying and trying to save some of his MPs who had done wrong things. And so he was replaced after a long summer campaign by Prime Minister Liz Truss, who lasted all of 44 days when the UK stock market was almost a collapse. The pound was becoming a level with the dollar and the euro, and eventually she was forced to resign. Now we have Rishi Sunak, our third Prime Minister in 3 months, who is trying to paint himself as Mr. Clean. He's the guy that's going to bring some sanity. The fact is that he's obviously miles better. Anybody would be better than Johnson and Truss. And now we've got a situation where this multi-billionaire, it's the first time we've had a prime minister that's got more money than the monarch in this country. He is he's almost as rich as God. And again, it's going to be very difficult for us in the UK, to be able to keep the pressure on. We will face a general election in 2024 under the statutory requirements, but none of us would be surprised, and I'm sure Louise would agree with this, if the Conservatives don't cut and run and try at some point to win an election when they think the time is right for them. We have a government that, even with Mr. Clean in Rishi Sunak, is already falling into traps. He's promoted somebody who was dismissed as Home Secretary because she compromised herself by posting private documents on her personal email, and she's now back in. She's lied to the Prime Minister about the circumstances of that. They brought in the Conservative Party chair and comrades is not based about what's good for the country. It is based around what is good for the Conservative Party. So what do we face in the next few months? Well, there will be an election in Scotland, in Holyrood, and our thinking is that will be very, very much a slam dunk win for the SNP. Labour, because of PR, Labour gets so many seats, and so do the Conservatives and another small nationalist party. But that would be a straightforward situation where they win, and then they will push for a referendum to leave the UK and eventually join the European Union. So that will pose many problems. The Conservatives will say no. They will try to stop it legally. And I think there will be a big backlash in Scotland. In Wales, the situation is slightly different. At the moment, there are no elections coming up. But in Northern Ireland, because there is no government in operation, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is now running the country and has ordered a general election for December this year. And I think it's fair to say, friends, that the situation will still come out very much the same, with a split vote. And hopefully, if there is some form of solution, it's not going to be a violent one, because, of course, as you know, Northern Ireland, we lived through nearly 30 years of violence on the streets of Belfast, and we don't want to see a return to that. The Labour Party at this moment in time has some goodwill with the public. Trade unions in the UK has goodwill. We have strikes in the rail and in the communications sector, in the postal sector. And there isn't massive criticism from the public as the Conservatives would have liked. Trade union membership is increasing, which is good, but not as high as that we would want in the long run. And we do hope that Labour's promise of bringing in legislation with its first 100 days to protect workers, to bring in collective bargaining in a number of industries, is actually honoured. I believe that it's going to be a long fight. I believe the Conservatives would do everything they can to remain in power. Nothing would surprise me. I think that there will be problems for them along the way. And our job in Labour is to oppose them and to make sure that they are held to account. In trade union movement, situation is as I say, a lot of support in my own union in Unite. We win disputes regularly, and in terms of political work, of course, circumstances are that we're focusing on our members at this moment in time in industry and in the areas that we cover. So, Louise and comrades, that gives you a brief rundown of where we are. And I'll take any questions if I can. I've seen some coming up, but if you can, Chair, if you just want to repeat them, I'll do my best to answer them in the short time that we've got. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks very much, Tony. Very, very interesting presentation. I've got a few questions already. I'll ask them. Shall I ask you a couple at a time, and then you can, yeah. Okay, just a comment from me actually, because I keep seeing statements from the UK government saying that they follow US policy in Nicaragua absolutely to the letter, and they keep saying,
Yeah.
you know, we want to bring democracy to Nicaragua, and I always say, you know, they ought to think first about bringing democracy to the UK.
Yeah.
But questions for you, Tony. One here, is the media biased against Nicaragua in the same way as here in the US? That's a media question, really. Do you consider the UK system to be a democracy? And do you think that the elections here are free and fair? And do they represent democracy? It's a bit the sort of same sides of the same question, two sides of the same question.
Okay. First of all, I agree with Louise's point there just about the way that the government represents itself on foreign policy. They not just follow the US, they have a very, very extreme view on Nicaragua, on Venezuela, and on other countries with a socialist left government. At times it beggars belief, their attitude, certainly in regard to issues like Palestine as well. How is the media on Nicaragua? Not very good. When there is coverage, and our campaign does a fantastic job of drawing to attention and every opportunity we get to try to put forward a positive message, either it doesn't get in the UK media, or it will be on the BBC, or it'll be on websites. Certainly in the popular press, I don't think it necessarily comes that way. There are honourable exceptions. The Morning Star newspaper does give good coverage, but I would say that all the editors of national newspapers in the UK and in the general media would say they give fair balance. The reality is they will do anything they can to avoid giving any praise or recognition to the good things that have been happening in Nicaragua. And the question about do we think we live in a democracy and our parliament? Look, we get often told we have the mother of democracy, the mother of the parliaments. The problem is that winner take all. I used to be in favour of first past the post. I've now, having been educated and spent more time talking to people who believe in proportional representation, I'm not sure which form people want to go for, but I have a view that this can't go on. This winner take all, where people are excluded, will lead to the continuing cycle of right-wing governments. And at this moment in time, don't forget, we had a prime minister after Boris Johnson who was elected by the Conservative MPs in Parliament, along with members of the Conservative Party. Average age a lot higher. Their attitudes, and that's why they voted for Truss, are really right-wing. They're opposed to the European Union. Many of them have extremist views. And they elected Truss. She lasted 44 days. This time round, the MPs alone elected Rishi Sunak. The MPs alone, they kept out the membership of the Conservative Party. So our Prime Minister was elected by 357 members of the Conservative Party. And as you know, there was a two-horse race, and the other final candidate, Penny Mordaunt, withdrew, leaving Sunak to receive a coronation. And he's been elected just by that small group of people. But that's the way it goes. They point out that the same thing happened when Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair, but that's the way it works. People in this country want a general election. There is a general view when you talk to people that they've had enough of this and they want a general election. Of course, the Conservatives are not going to grant that, but we have a big rally in London on Wednesday where the campaign will be kicking off to press for a general election. And I think that if we had a general election, Labour could certainly win it, first past the post. It might well be that we face some form of coalition. Is that okay, Louise?
Yeah, I've got one more, which is a sort of question more about foreign policy, and it's whether the question has come through to me. Will UK policy and foreign policy in particular, and involvement in Ukraine, is that likely to change in the near future, or if and when a Labour government gets elected, when we have elections?
Right. Okay. The policy of the Conservative government and the Labour Party is to support Ukraine. Labour will say that our policy is to try to bring about peace in the area, in the region. If you believe Boris Johnson, nothing short of total victory, as he said. Liz Truss, exactly the same. Sunak may be slightly different because the crisis that the UK will face economically in terms of living costs, energy costs, etc., and the cuts that they'll have to make to public services are going to be significant. So I think that maybe it will come to the point where some ordinary folks, ordinary people, begin to ask questions about why are we spending all this money. No doubt about it. Situation in Ukraine, what we've seen and what we've watched on TV is beyond belief. However, I have a view that Johnson particularly wanted to have a war in the Baltics. He is a big fan of Winston Churchill. In fact, he thinks he is Winston Churchill at times. And a war always deflects from domestic politics. And I can anticipate that Sunak will try to pin the blame of any economic problems in the UK on Putin. I also have a view that we advised our comrades in the unions in Central and Eastern Europe, do not trust Johnson. He has a very short attention span, and once he gets bored with it, he would have gone. And I think they've heeded that, and I think that the Conservative Party at some point may actually try to find a way, rather than just continue to push the war, to find a way to try to resolve it. The other problem is that when you explain to people, the problem is that the decision to make noises to join NATO was the European Union should have been very, very clear about that. Joining the European Union, I don't have a problem with that, but you can't fast track people through to it. And I think it sent many of the wrong signals to Putin, but that doesn't give any excuses for what he's done. Labour, I don't think, if there was an election, I don't think they would change tack. However, what I do think they would try to do is to see if there was a way to bring peace to the region. But while Putin's there, I mean, the problem we've also got, Louise, I just want to say this, they're hypocrites, the Conservatives. Russia and Putin and his friends have done more to undermine the UK in terms of their support for Brexit, in terms of the money that they pour into the Conservative Party privately. London is awash with dirty money. And yet, there we are fighting a war. Okay, they've expelled a few people, but at the end of the day, the Conservatives are still getting money from the Soviet or the Russian oligarchs.
Okay,
So
I don't think I have any more questions. So.
Yes, I want to thank Tony Burke for his presentation and answering these questions. It was very illuminating. We would like to move on to some of the other speakers, but maybe one more quick question for both Louise and Tony, which is, are you going to be able to stay warm this winter in the UK? Is it going to work out in terms of fuel or heat?
I think it's going to be very difficult for some people. I think the electricity bills are going up and up and up. And I think there will be a real problem for people with families, in particular, as to whether they eat or they heat. It's as simple as that. The oil companies and energy companies are making more money than they know what to do with. And Labour suggested that they should bring in a windfall tax. The Conservatives have opposed that. What I think they will do, they may bring it in the November 17th budget and steal Labour's clothes. I don't know what you think, Louise.
I absolutely agree. And you know, we've got a government of millionaires, and they are millionaires and billionaires, telling the poorest in the country, people who are really struggling, telling them to make cuts. You know, well, wear something warmer, use less heating, you know,
Yeah.
You can buy cheaper meals, you know, and it's absolutely disgraceful what's happening. You know, and we, you know, my home, I know, you know, we're comfortable, we'll probably stay warm, but there are thousands of families, tens of thousands around the country, really, really struggling. you know, kids going to school hungry. You just wouldn't believe it for here, but it's happening. And you know, quicker we, you know, get this government cares about nobody but its rich friends, and it's just appalling situation. So.
Well, sorry. Well, our thoughts will be with you for sure.
We need
Yeah.
your help. We'll send a message to you. Send food.
We do indeed. The
Oh.
RMT, the transport union, has been on strike over here, and we got a message sent over from the Nicaraguan trade unions, a message of solidarity to our railway union. So that was that's happening. It's really good.
That labor solidarity, how wonderful it is. Well, thank you again, Tony Burke. We're going to move on now to the next speaker. We're very pleased to have.
Bye.
Bye. Oh, feel free to stay, but but we're going to.
No, I gotta go.
Okay. Okay. Bye. Our next speaker is Margaret Kimberly, and she's from the United States. She lives in New York City. She will focus on the United States in her talk. She's executive editor of Black Agenda Report and author of the book Prejudential: Black America and the Presidents. In addition to being a coordinating committee member of Black Alliance for Peace, she's an administrative committee member of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the board of directors of the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. She's also a board member of Consortium News and the editorial board of the International Manifesto Group. She's been a member of delegations visiting Nicaragua. Welcome, Margaret Kimberly. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara, and greetings to all of you. I really appreciate the invitation to join this panel today as we discuss democracy. As an activist, I've often been at marches, and the chant, "This is what democracy looks like," is often heard. And that's a true manifestation of democracy, presenting what the people want as a political possibility. The people want the government to act on their behalf and offer them some protections from the worst of the capitalist system. They want public money to be spent on their needs. They don't want to be unhoused or see others unhoused. They want the minimum wage to be a living wage, and they want guaranteed health care that they can afford. They don't want a college education to mean a lifetime of debt peonage, and the people want peace. They don't want a federal budget in which most of discretionary spending goes towards defense spending, but that's what we have. Here in the US, we are having what we call midterm elections on Tuesday, November 8th. That is to say, an election taking place in the middle of a 4-year presidential term. Every member of the House of Representatives is up for re-election, 1/3 of the senators, and their local and state elections across the country. People here are always exhorted to vote, but they're discouraged from any other political activity, which tells you what you need to know about the limits of electoral politics. This year, we're told democracy itself is at stake because of the Trump supporters, but democracy is always at stake when you're ruled by an oligarchic class, and that's what we have here. They rule, they operate through a duopoly represented by Democrats and Republicans. Democrats are allegedly the left party and Republicans the right. Actually, they're both right-wing and both participate in the charade of democracies. Both market themselves to segments of the population through a variety of issues. It may be abortion or access to firearms or fiscal policy, any number of things. And there are widely divergent opinions on these issues, but there's remarkable similarity on what people want. For example, the federal minimum wage has not gone up since the 90s. Most people think it should be higher. Most people want a government, a national healthcare system that would provide free or low cost care, but there's never any change on these issues. In fact, Joe Biden, during his 2020 campaign, made clear he would veto any effort to create the national healthcare system that people want. There's collusion between the two parties. The party out of power will say they want peace, but sometimes, once in power, they continue imperialist policy. The war party is completely bipartisan. And I have a quote straight from the horse's mouth. During the 2020 presidential election, the CEO of Boeing, one of the biggest defense contractors, said, quote, "I think both candidates, at least in my view, appear globally oriented and interested in the defense of our country, and I believe they'll support our industries. I don't think we're going to take a position on one being better than the other," unquote. And he was right, of course. When Trump was president and Democrats controlled the House, they gave him more defense spending than he requested. They established a new branch of the military, the Space Force, which, despite its comical name, is an effort to militarize space. Now, Biden and the Democrats have allocated billions of dollars, and with the Republicans, billions of dollars to the military-industrial complex via the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, they've shoved blue and yellow flags down our throats and presented Zelensky everywhere, even at the Grammy Music Awards, and that is to get our buy-in for war and dissuade us from seeking peace. Joe Biden won the Democratic Party nomination because I'm getting a message, my connection's unstable. I hope you can still hear me. Biden won the Democratic nomination because former President Obama and the Democratic Party oligarchs chose him. They didn't want Bernie Sanders, a phony progressive, more about that later, even a little bit of reform. And so suddenly the large Democrats who were running for president began to drop out. They were told to drop out, and Obama and the people he represents put all their money and influence behind Biden. So we go to the polls and vote for whomever has been chosen already. Voters come in at the end of the process. But that's not the only obstacle. There are states which don't allow people, for example, don't allow people with past felony convictions to vote, or have stringent ID requirements that marginalize poor people. These are mostly Republican initiatives to limit Democrats' voting power, but what do Democrats do to help their voters? Well, we hear a lot, as an example, about abortion since Roe v. Wade was overturned, but we have states that are controlled by Republicans. And why is that? The same party, Democrats, who tell us to vote as if our lives depend on it because Republicans are fascists, do nothing to help their party at the state and local level. Democrats lost more than 900 seats across the country when Obama was president. They prioritize the presidency. Why? So they can cut deals with Republicans. Nancy Pelosi is very funny, often says we need a strong Republican Party. Why would she care about the Republican Party? But she's telling an awful truth. She needs a strong Republican Party so that she can cut deals. It's harder for us to do if the people who rioted in the Capitol on January 6th are the face of the Republicans. If you don't believe me, Barack Obama has reappeared, of course, running around the country, stumping for candidates, talking about how the Republicans will cut Social Security and Medicare. Well, he presented a plan to cut Social Security and Medicare when he was in the White House. I guess he hopes we all have amnesia about that. But it's hard to talk about democracy in a country that's so backward in its politics. Donald Trump dealt with losing by declaring that he didn't lose and mobilizing his supporters to attack the system altogether. Republicans across the country are trying to undermine the electoral process and the role of officials such as secretaries of state who determine how voting processes are carried out. Voting was made easier in 2020 in the wake of the COVID pandemic. There's more voting by mail, more early voting. That's a good thing. But what do you have in Arizona right now? Trump supporters armed patrolling voting drop boxes where people can leave paper ballots because they say that the ballot boxes are being stuffed. So it's very difficult when you have a reactionary country and there's no effective left. In fact, the leading left party, the Green Party, has been under sustained attack by the Democrats. North Carolina, for example, people who signed petitions to get Greens on the ballot were directly intimidated. They were called on the phone. Some Democrat operatives even went to their homes to get them to rescind their signatures. But they survived the challenge and will be on the ballot. But here in New York, where I live, a former governor used a budget bill to increase the threshold for ballot access, and the Greens and other small parties have been kicked off. So what should democracy look like? It should be a system where the people have the possibility of having their needs met through the political system. Instead, ours meets the needs of rich people and corporations, and at our expense. So the student loan debt relief program that the public clamored for was tiny and of use to only a small number of people. There's more than $1 trillion in student loan debt, by the way. The stimulus programs ended after just 1 year, and they went on and on about a Build Back Better bill, which didn't materialize because the oligarchs didn't want it. We live under billionaire rule, and they are determined to have austerity, not just a decrease in government spending, but an impoverished and precarious population. Change comes through mass action. That's the only way we've ever gotten it in the United States. People here will fetishize what's called the civil rights movement, the liberation movement, but they leave out the part about people working in mass for years at a time to challenge the system to do what they knew the system didn't want. And that's the only way to have a real democracy. The electoral system can work, but it certainly doesn't happen on the federal level. And we saw a sad example of this in recent days when so-called progressives in Congress were publicly confronted regarding their support for giving billions of dollars to the Ukrainian government. Their solution was to write a letter to Biden repeating their support of his policies while claiming they were in support of negotiations with Russia. But the pushback from the White House and their leadership was immediate, and they retracted what they'd written less than 24 hours later. They were unprincipled and also just plain stupid, too stupid to even put up a front for a short period of time. And progressives are part of this charade. They need them to trick us into thinking there's political difference when there isn't. And by the way, I think we have to talk about the dangers of nuclear war, which have been escalated by the US. Treaties with Russia and other countries which limited nuclear proliferation have been allowed to expire. And this has been going on for several administrations. And Biden blurts out in his own bizarre way, we're facing nuclear Armageddon, which Vladimir Putin has said nothing about, by the way. But the lack of democracy in the US and other Western nations, and we heard from a speaker about the UK, one of the US's closest vassal states, and they brought the world to the brink. So this critique of democracy, so-called, I think applies in the rest of the NATO and EU nations. But I can't think of a better moment for people to speak up and show what democracy really does look like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. I always enjoy your presentations. You always make me think. Okay, we're going to move on to the next speaker, and we'll hold questions until the end, but please do start putting questions in the chat for the remaining speakers. Next, we'll hear from Graham Russell, who will discuss democracy as experienced in the Northern Triangle of Central America, especially Honduras and Guatemala. He's been director since 1995 of the Canada and US-based nonprofit organization Rights Action, which is working in Honduras and Guatemala to support land, environmental, and human rights defenders. He's a non-practicing Canadian lawyer and a part-time adjunct professor at University of Northern British Columbia. He's co-editor of the recently published book, Testimonial, Canadian Mining in the Aftermath of Genocides in Guatemala. Graham Russell, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me in on this, and I will keep this brief. I mainly want to focus on what I think is a framework for having a discussion about democracy or the lack of democracy. I think this is true in many countries in the Americas. I think it's particularly true in Central American history. And today, unfortunately, it's very true in Honduras and Guatemala. With more time in a discussion like this, I think one would easily throw in Haiti, which is once again back in the news. And the nation state system, the nation state framework is, I just think, an inadequate framework for understanding the lack of democracy. And so to put it another way, in my own understanding of these issues through my work in Central America, mainly over the last 30 years plus, the biggest violator of human rights in Central America, the biggest cause, the number one cause of exploitation and endemic poverty, and the biggest obstacle to real democracy is the United States itself. Like, it is the obstacle inside other countries. And to be a bit more fair, it's not just the US. The US is the big elephant in the room, but it always works in concert with entities like the World Bank and the IMF, and it works in concert with countries, specifically Canada, and also Britain will always do whatever the US does in the Latin American region. And then it works in concerts with numerous multinational companies. These are the obstacles to democracy in so many countries in the Americas. And then we'll hear about Nicaragua shortly. And when a country breaks away from the efforts of the US-led, sort of call it US-led Western imperialism in the Americas, they face all kinds of obstacles to undermine the government that's trying to break away from US-led Western control. And that, for me, is the framework of understanding as to where democracy's at in a place like Guatemala or Honduras today. And the situation gets worsened, particularly in Canada and the US, because of the role of the media in our countries. The situation gets worsened in Canada and the US because there's this fundamentally no political oversight at all for what our governments do through their foreign policy actions, or what our companies do, or what entities like the World Bank and the IMF do. And then there's no legal accountability fundamentally whatsoever for US or Canadian foreign policy that undermines democracy, that violates human rights, that contributes to poverty and exploitation. So the biggest blocks to the lack of democracy in many countries, and I would include Honduras, Guatemala, and Haiti, though I'm not going to talk about Haiti, comes almost from outside the country. Though, to be honest, they always work in concert with local political elites, military elites, and economic elites. It's a partnership. Very briefly, Guatemala. Guatemala is just one ongoing, very bad situation. There is no light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the lack of democracy in Guatemala, in terms of endemic human rights violations, and in terms of endemic exploitation and poverty of the majority population, which is indigenous. There's all kinds of extraordinary movements for change, but there's no light at the end of the tunnel in the near future for what's happening in Guatemala, because the corrupt, so just a brief history. In 1954, as anyone listening to this talk will know, the US overthrew the democratically elected government of Guatemala, and that's where Guatemala's modern day nightmare begins. US-backed repression in US-backed military regimes in the 70s and 80s into the early 90s carried out widespread massacres across the country, disappearances, genocide in certain Mayan regions of the country. Those two dates, the 54 coup was to remove from power Democrats and bring back to power the traditional economic, military, political elites. The repression in the 70s and 80s and early 90s was to keep in power the traditional economic, military, and political elites. Virtually nothing has changed in Guatemala as to how it operates as an unjust, exploitative, racist country since the so-called peace accords in the 90s. These are generalizations. And then the electoral process becomes a hollowed out charade that gets used by the elites in Guatemala and then by the US and Canadian governments that consider, and the media parrots this, they consider the regime in power in Guatemala as a democratic ally in any international forum, the OAS, the United Nations, or when something like the ad hoc Lima group is set up by the Canadian government to help garner pressure on Venezuela to overthrow the government of Venezuela. We set up a group of democracies and we bring in countries like Guatemala. And so it's a very closed circle right now, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel in the short term in Guatemala. And I'm not, that doesn't give me great joy saying that. It's just, I think, the nature of how things are operating there today. Honduras has some similarities and some differences. The key date to understand Honduras' huge challenges today is the coup in 2009, without going back into ancient history. And the US and Canada backed a military coup in 2009, ousted a mildly reformist mainstream government in 2009, and inaugurated almost 13 years of profoundly repressive, profoundly corrupt, profoundly organized crime, and infiltrated all entities of the state and society for 13 years. And it was known as the narco trafficking regime headed up by Juan Orlando Hernandez. During the 12 years in power, almost 13 years, all the indicators of well-being in Honduras society, which were weak to begin with in 2009, went down the toilet. So the indications of poverty and exploitation went out the roof. The number of Hondurans forced into forced migrancy and refugee flight were the highest since the early 80s. The levels of corruption and infiltration of the judiciary, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the military and the police all went out the roof, with organized crime and narco trafficking dominating the organized crime scene in Honduras. And all the while, the Honduran government carried out 3 sets of profoundly corrupt, violent, undemocratic elections. Every single time the Canadian and US governments parroted, officially recognizing them as democratically legitimate elections, the media went along with it as a generalization, and nothing changed. It is to great credit of the Honduran people, through this extraordinary mass grassroots movement in opposition to the coup, that they were able to oust the narco dictatorship in the electoral process of late last year, early this year. And now the new, actually democratically elected government of Honduras they're working at such a deficit, it's mind-numbing, the challenges they faced in trying to root out corruption and impunity that have infiltrated all branches of the state and society. And while dealing with the highest levels of poverty in recent Honduran history, and then not surprisingly, there's already an overt effort on behalf of the government of the United States to start pressuring the government of the elected government of President Xiomara Castro to implement pro-global business, pro-global investor and bank policies. So Honduras is in an extraordinarily delicate situation right now as to trying to carve out their own path, which, and there's echoes of what Nicaragua has been trying to do for 20 years with facing extraordinary pressure from the United States. Well, Honduras is starting to feel all of those pressures all over again because they're daring to try and take their country in a different direction. So I'm going to leave the comments there on Honduras and Guatemala at that. And I'd be glad to answer more questions, discuss this further in the question period. But I just want to reiterate the key point that the nation state framework is not a sufficient framework to discuss issues of human rights, democracy, poverty, and exploitation in many countries of the global south, including Honduras and Guatemala. And that in the Americas, the US-led cabal of rich, powerful countries, banks, investors, and multinational companies are fundamentally some of the biggest obstacles that we need to address in Canada and the US if countries like Guatemala and Honduras are ever going to have a chance to carve out their own direction. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Graham, for that interesting presentation and for your insights into what's happening in those countries. I'm sure we'll get some questions at the end. Our final speaker is Susan Lagos, who will focus on Nicaragua. Susan taught high school and university Spanish and ESL for 30 years. She has lived in Ciudad del Rio, Matagalpa, Nicaragua for the past 18 years, where she retired to co-own a farm. Previously, she lived in other Latin American countries for 18 years, including growing up in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. She has volunteered and participated in numerous delegations in Nicaragua and across Latin America with Friends of the ATC, School of the Americas Watch, Alliance for Global Justice, and Code Pink. Her article about 60 Minutes coverage of Nicaragua appeared in Covert Action magazine in July 2022. Originally from the United States, she recently became a Nicaraguan citizen and will be able to vote in the upcoming municipal elections in November. Susan Lagos, you have the floor.
Unmute. Okay, now you can hear me. Can you hear? Okay, good. I just want to say one thing before I start my spiel about what Graham was saying is the interference of the United States in this area has been going on for so long. I was just reading late into the night last night about Cornelius Vanderbilt, who brought so many people along the Rio San Juan to find gold in California in the 1850s. And I thought, this is weird. I just bought Anderson Cooper's book in the airport on the way home. And he doesn't at one time mention where his great-great-great-grandfather got all the money to start all of his huge businesses was right here, moving people across Nicaragua. He doesn't mention that once. So there you go. Okay, here comes my official spiel. We have municipal elections coming up on Sunday, not Tuesday, on Sunday, November 6th. Where over 3 million Nicaraguans over 18 will be voting. And we have 15 departments, which are like our states, and 2 autonomous regions in the Caribbean. And that means we have 153 municipal elections, each with a separate ballot for mayor, vice mayor, and city council. And by law in our country, 50% of those people have to be women in all elections in Nicaragua now, which I'm very proud of. Makes a huge difference to empower women in this country. Okay, so the Supreme Electoral Council swore in several people to run these elections. They're all half and half, again, like I said, men and women. And how they do that is whoever won in the last elections get the first 2 positions. And so the Sandinistas only have 9, and the Liberal, which is not liberal in our sense, party has 8 departments that they are the top one. So it'll be very interesting elections. Okay, so these local polling stations are 3 people, the president, the first member, the second member, and they are usually, the elections happen in schools, and they're set up by your address. I live about 3 blocks from where I'm gonna vote in a school nearby. So total, there's like, 80,000 board members that have been accredited in 8,000 different tables. People think that only the FSLN is in power here, but there are actually 7 parties listed. I don't know if I need to go through all of them. I have them here on the paper. There's one that's only in the Caribbean called Yatama, and the Liberal Party has like 3 different parts of it. There's a Christian party, and so there are, like I say, on the ballot, there are 6 parties most places and 7 in the Caribbean. that extra one, Yatama. Okay, and people, it's also set up so that people who don't read well can identify which party they want, because there is a box number and there's a photo of the leader as well as their name. So in Nicaragua, when we go like this, it's not a peace sign, it's vote in box number 2 for the FSLN. Okay. There was an opposition party named Citizens for Liberty that was denounced by the Liberal Party in the last election because their candidate was a dual citizen and had 2 different names, and frequently met with the US ambassador. So she was not allowed to run because she was a dual citizen, and that's against the law here. A lot of people talk about those vote pre-candidates in the United States. We know they weren't pre-candidates who were they were not registered with a party, a legal party. They had no platform, no followers, and they were all investigated for money laundering, fraud, conspiracy, and treason. And in any country, that would be illegal. And so all that stuff you see about, quote, pre-candidates is non-existent. They're just trying to make them look like they were candidates, and they weren't. Nobody would vote for them here. On election day, actually just before that, in August, everybody had to online, you could do it online this time, to verify your voting place. And you could also go to your voting place and look on the list to be sure you're there in case somebody moves because of work. That doesn't happen as much in Nicaragua. Most people stay in the same place. But just checking to be sure you're still on the list. And the day of voting, you come up with your cédula, your ID card, and they have a roll, and they look at it and they see that you're on there. You have your picture, they check, is that you? They have your signature on the roll. Is that your signature? And so then you're okay to come in. They give you a ballot that the committee there has just signed on the back and stamped it with your voting place, so it can't be copied or anything. You've only got one vote. You mark it in the booth, you bring it back to the box, and they stain with ink your thumb, usually, unless you don't have a thumb, you can have a finger or whatever. So that keeps you from voting for your dead twin brother or whatever that people are always saying. There's all these dead people voting. It doesn't happen here. Okay. And there are very short lines. Probably in the last election when Margaret was here and other Yoav has been here, probably 10-15 minutes is the max in a voting line because there's so many spots to vote in so many places. So then after all this, at the end of the day, the president and the first member, who are 2 different parties, count the ballots and they write up the minutes of the results. And they go in person, walking to the municipal office with a police escort. And then they turn in those ballots and the minutes, and those are retabulated. And then they get escorted by those people to the department, which would be like the state level. And then those get escorted by the army to Managua. So there's basically no way that you could mess up with this system. Back in the time of Aleman, I remember so many people told me votes were showed up in the ditch, and this way it couldn't happen because you're being escorted. You got them all in your hand. You've got the minutes. You've got everything's all tabulated. The model of democracy that we have here is pretty amazing. And when I went to the inauguration, the president, when he got his sash again, he held it up and said, I want you also to take the vote. The pueblo es presidente in Nicaragua. And we all swore. It was pretty amazing. What does that mean? It means everybody's involved all the time. It's not just for voting. Of course, in voting, there's like 250,000 people working in the elections now. And there's also a human rights advocate in case you are discriminated against. There's a policeman there to be sure nobody's doing anything untoward, which is so much better than I remember. I remember being here in the early 2000s elections. I actually had a guy handing out machetes and rocks right around my corner. It was pretty scary. Let me tell you, it was a scary time. And it's much more calm now. Haven't seen anything like that for years and years. There's also, everybody's involved in a disaster preparedness. Every family has their plan now, their escape plan. And the Senapred that Nan mentioned takes immediate action before and after floods, earthquakes, or hurricanes. Also, the healthcare is amazing here. Now, I think we're up to like 90% of COVID vaccination, but they also come door to door vaccinating you. Your children are now being vaccinated for polio, everybody for flu and pneumonia. And even after this, a lot of flooding, there was a possibility of this disease that's kind of scary called leptospirosis. People were getting their medicine for that when they were in a flooded area. There's a traveling clinic that goes around from place to place that's like a converted container with all kinds of special exams. You can get the healthcare here is free and available everywhere. So one thing, in the United States especially, I can't speak for other countries, but in the United States, I know campaigns are very expensive when you're on TV with these expensive ads and everything. But here for the FSLN, the Sandinista Party, they're not necessary because the people are permanently acting in the barrios, in the rural communities, working to restore human rights. So clean water, electricity, roads, decent homes, and sports, all these things that the public is asking for are being restored every day. Like Dan talking about that bridge on the Wawa River is incredible because all those Mosquito indigenous people in that area are finally connected. I know people that used to take 3 weeks to get to Puerto Cabezas, and now it takes under 10 hours. It's amazing. It's amazing how this government is helping everybody in every corner of the country. It's not just in Managua. Electricity was only 43% 15 years ago. Now it's 99, just to give you an idea. Also, the government gives the materials for daily meals for students in primary school all over the country. There's free childcare for working mothers. There's maternal homes that are pre-birth, the last 2 weeks of your pregnancy, and you get a free ride to the ambulance to the hospital from there. And also every month they come around spraying for mosquitoes. We've had a lot of rain this year. And that's for people not to get dengue, malaria, and chikungunya. So, like I say, that's why people vote for the FSLN, for the Sandinista Party. It's not a dictatorship like everybody wants to say in the North, because he got 75% in this last election. Why? Because the party's doing all these things for everybody to lift them out of poverty. That's their goal. So what do we not have? We don't have Citizens United controlling all the contributions to these candidates and spending, a lot of money to support these people we were just talking about that are making all the weapons for war. We don't have an electoral college, and we aren't locked into that two-party system. If your little dinky party, number 6, gets 5%, you get represented on the city council or the National Assembly. Okay, that's basically it. If you have any questions, I didn't even mention sanctions. That maybe Sophia or somebody else wants to talk about sanctions, but that's my 12 minutes, I think.
Thank you. Susan, you stuck right to the 12 minutes. That really helps us. Susan, I'm going to ask the first question then. This question is directed to you, but we're moving into the section of the webinar where we'll be posing questions for various speakers, okay? How would you, Susan, define democracy, and how does that relate to the human rights that you see in Nicaragua?
Wow, I think I pretty much defined democracy just now. To me, it is having people taking part in government all the time. It's not just voting. It's people saying, wait, we just went through a flood and I don't have a roof, and getting the government coming right away to give you a roof. here in my town that I live in, we don't have a very good water system. And one person I know is going around finding out from everybody who needs a sewer system. Basically, there's areas of Darío that don't have a sewer system, and the water from you washing clothes or taking a shower is running down the street. So that's one of the big things that Darío really, really needs, and they're finally getting around to it. So they're the water company's doing that. It's run by the government. So I think democracy is happening, like I say, every day. It's not just on the day that we vote. What was the second half of that? I forget.
Just how does that relate to human rights in general? There are political rights as well as social and economic rights.
Right, that's what I was saying in my talk, that human rights aren't just somebody because you're trans wanting to vote. Nobody's laughing at you because there's a human rights person right there not allowing that. It's not just that, but to us, human rights are right to have a decent home, which is a huge project right now. There's thousands and thousands of houses being built in Managua, as well as in all the different departments for people that don't have decent housing. Boy, I sure would like to see that in LA and San Francisco. I know it's a huge problem in California, where I'm from. Gosh, I mean, I think I pretty much covered it by saying everything I said. Maybe I was talking too fast, but having clean water, having electricity, when people in the 80s in the northern part of this country didn't have telephones, didn't have electricity, didn't have running water. It's huge now that they all do, and they can have their little business in their house and sell cold drinks or whatever they want to do, have tools that are electric, and it's just huge. It's democracy is everywhere. It's not just on the day you're voting.
Thank you, Susan. I'll turn Louise.
Okay, yeah, that's a question for Graham. There's two related questions really, relating to Honduras. The first question: after so many years of control and manipulation of the system in Honduras by the neoliberals and narco criminals, how fragile is the Castro government, and how difficult will it be for it to stay in power? In other words, how strong are the reactionary forces now, and how likely is a further coup? And a related question is, what can we do to support the Castro government to resist pressures from the United States?
It's very fragile. Not that there's not extraordinarily capable people in the government, but it's very fragile for the reasons I tried to set out and other people have referred to in my very, quick generalized remarks. The US is already openly resisting and opposing needed policies of the Honduran regime. The deficit that the incoming government has is beyond imaginable when you have a narco trafficking regime that corrupted all the institutions of the state. Literally, there were narco traffickers in the military, the police, the judiciary, the executive branch, and Congress in the National Party, and they're still there. Some of them are being shipped off to New York to face trial. Most of them are still there. The cartels, the organized crime cartels, are still operating in the country. And all of that was fundamentally backed by the US-led so-called international community, either directly or indirectly. And then for the reasons why we're holding this webinar, and why Nicaragua is facing so much pressure from the US-led international community, any efforts that the Xiomara Castro government is going to try and go in the direction that's needed, serious economic reform, serious social reform, serious land distribution, serious everything, they will be opposed by their elites and their international partners, and it's already happening. Is there a chance of another coup? Absolutely. Do I think it's going to happen soon? I doubt it, but yes, there's absolutely a chance at another coup in Honduras, and the media will play its role to justify the coup. The ambassador is already doing the buildup, setting the tone by saying, well, they're not respecting They're undermining international investment. They're undermining good economic development policies. They're violating laws, this, that, and the other thing. It's always a slow buildup to set the stage for a coup, but they will put in place all of the so-called excuses they need, such that if and when a coup is carried out by the traditional military, economic, and political elites, the US will come on board, Canada will come on board, just like we did last time, and the media will play its role. I'm not sure it'll play itself out that way, but it's absolutely a possibility, and it fundamentally comes down to how much will the new government push for, and the new government has very strong support from the Honduran society, even though it's a desperately impoverished society. So it is an extraordinarily delicate situation. And the biggest support that people in the US should do, but Canada as well, is we need to really try our best, as always, to hold our governments accountable, our companies accountable, our World Bank that's controlled predominantly by the US accountable, so that they don't contribute through their policies and actions to the undermining and the weakening, and sooner or later the demonizing of the new government of Honduras. Honduras' future of democracy and well-being for its populations is as much in the hands of the United States and Canada as it is in the hands of its own elected government, if not more so.
Thank you, Graham. I think we may just have time for one more question. We'll see, because we are going to try to close promptly on the half hour. I'm directing this question to Margaret, and it's a rather general question, but given the challenges of our electoral system and the fact that, you know, the two parties are controlling so much of it, and they seem so similar in many ways, do you have suggestions for US voters this time around in the midterms?
Don't vote for anybody you don't want to vote for. I don't tell people not to participate, despite my critiques of the process. If you believe it benefits your community to participate, then you should, but don't allow people to guilt whip you into voting for warmongers. And I mean the Democrats. They're usually the ones to critique, aren't they? Because they're the ones who pretend not to be what they are. Don't vote for people you don't want to vote for. And political activity, democracy is found in organizing and in our actions, and not in our electoral system. Speak up. The fact that you're here, I think most people here are organizers and activists to some degree, but I think it's the most important thing not to support these people who pretend, to be an anti-imperialist. I think if you're on this call, you are someone who understands the importance of fighting against imperialism, and you should never give that up. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. We are in a serious situation in the US, in Canada, in the UK, and all these countries. We're seeing these protests across Europe because these governments are not democratic. And we're in a fight, but we have to fight that good fight and remain anti-imperialist, and don't vote for people who are imperialists, that is.
Thank you, Margaret. Louise, do you have one last? Oh, Susan has her hand up, I think. Susan?
Yeah. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, somebody had something about using latrines. Of course, Nicaragua's like what, a huge amount of people live in the Campo and have latrines. It's only city people that have flushing toilets. So yeah, we have a lot of composting latrines all over the place. And Margaret had a question that were these people being vaccinated, was that forced? No, you have a choice in Nicaragua. You can either vaccinate or not vaccinate. Nobody's being forced, but most people do it. I think that I answered everything that I could.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, final question, which is for Margaret and others. please comment about folks like Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg, and in a different way, sorry, I've lost the question now, in a different way, now, who are saying now, a different way, Ralph Nader, who are saying now, with the threat of fascism from the Republicans, we must vote Democrat, not any other party such as Green. At the same time, they often recognize how Democrats and Republicans are both terrible on foreign policy. So it's a very wide and open-ended question, but people can be brief, maybe.
Sure. That's why I don't listen to people like Chomsky, because he has these brilliant critiques and then says you have to keep voting for Democrats. Then I think he should be ignored. I pay no attention to them. At the end of the day, these people are collaborators, and I have no use for them. That's my brief response.
Well, I want to thank everyone for attending today. Before we close, I'm going to ask any of the speakers who have some final remarks, something you're just burning to say before we close. This is your chance to do that now. And perhaps we could do it in the order that you spoke, of Margaret, and then Graham, and then Susan.
Thank you. I think those of us on this call have the ability to share with other people what we know about the undemocratic nature of the US and the fact that it tries to, as we've all talked about, interfere in the affairs of other countries. So we must really stand for democracy, that is to say, a process where the people's needs are met. And that is the most important thing, and not to allow ourselves to be distracted by January 6th or just the name Donald Trump or any other such foolishness. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. I think I would just be echoing what other folks have said, but I think the challenges we face today are the same ones we've been facing for generations. And I just reiterate that I think the US-led Western imperialist forces are the greatest obstacle to democracy, to economic well-being for the majority populations, and to respect for human rights in many regions of the Americas. And so what should we do in Canada and the US, but always work to hold ourselves accountable for when our governments are undermining or intervening in other countries, direct military invasions, illegal economic sanctions, etc., to undermine democracy, to contribute to human rights violations. And we should openly support governments, and Nicaragua is the clearest example in today's forum, that are trying to strike out on, and are successfully striking out on their own path, and rebuilding from the bottom up their democracies. And that is our historic struggle, and it's an ongoing struggle that will go on, I think, for generations to come, because we have to recognize that it's sort of an imperialist global order, and the US leads it, but Canada and our multinational companies, the World Bank, Britain, are all part of it, and it's up to us to hold ourselves to account. Thank you.
And I just have one thing to say very quickly. We should not just be supporters of revolutionary governments. We should be working on our own revolutionary work where we are. Thank you all. Thank you to the organizers and everybody who put this together.
Thank you.
Do I get to say one last thing?
You do.
I really encourage, if you haven't been to Nicaragua, please come and see with your own eyes. You don't have to believe me. And also, you know, if you've been, send somebody else. We just need a lot of people to see what's really happening here. And I've been to Honduras several times, and my heart just hurts for Honduras, especially being right next door. But I just love being able to wake up in the morning and turn on the news, and it's all really good stuff about what's happening in Nicaragua. And
how about Haiti?
You need to come someplace where the news is great. I don't know about Haiti.
I do.
Come see Nicaragua.
Okay, Carolyn, we're getting ready to close now, but thank you for your participation. So this webinar has been recorded, and the recording will be sent out to everyone who registered within the next few days, along with some supplemental materials. And in addition to that, you will be able, in a few days at least, to be able to find the recording on the YouTube channel of Massachusetts Peace Action. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming today. I think we'll say goodbye now.
Thank you. Peace. No occupation of Haiti.
Amen.
Let me send you my poem about Haiti.